Hi guys, we are back with chapter 29 in book Scavenger. Emily and James are still in a fight, but it seems like Emily and Matthew are gonna hang out, her brother, which is really great. It looks like Emily found another clue to Mr. Griswold's game, so we are in it right now. We are over halfway done. Oh, I just love this book so much. All right, here we go, chapter 29. The day after her fight with James was the first time in the week since starting Booker that Emily felt lost in the big school. Not lost in the I can't find my classroom sense, but in the where do I fit in sense. With every school she'd attended in the past, she'd always started with an identity that pretty much saw her through the end, whether it was loner girl with her nose in a book, or in New Mexico and Colorado, or Matthew's little sister before that. She wasn't always wild about the identity, but it was comfortable to have one and to feel like you knew the role you were supposed to play. At Booker, she started from day one as James's friend. She didn't know what role to play anymore. At lunch, it hadn't seemed right to hang out in the library without James, so she went into the cafeteria, which was about as loud as a marching band practicing in a bathroom. She saw Vivian, the girl from her English and social studies classes who'd first introduced herself as their class president. But Vivian was involved in a conversation with other girls at her table and didn't look her way. Emily continued outside. Booker had an enormous blacktop where they had recess and PE and lunch. Emily found a stretch along the school building that was empty, other than some pushy seagulls, and leaned against the wall, pulling out the Maltese Falcon and her lunch bag. Hello, loner girl with her nose in a book. Haven't seen you in a while, she thought. In Mr. Quisling's class, James and Emily sat turned away from each other. Maddie took one look at them and said, "Uh-oh, things look tense for the clubhouse gang." She slid into the seat behind James. Did somebody reveal the secret password to a non-member? Shut up, Maddie, James muttered. He was methodically solving another of his logic puzzles and didn't look up. Emily pretended to be too absorbed in doodling a maze onto the margin of her notebook to have paid any attention. At the start of class, James bent over his backpack and pulled out a handful of long, skinny strips of paper. "I brought a makeup cipher for yesterday," he announced to Mr. Quisling. Emily ducked her head to look at Maddie and was pleased to see her gaping. She saw Emily looking at her and snapped her mouth shut. Her eyes were wide and blinking, and it occurred to Emily that Maddie might actually be nervous about losing her bet. "Did you?" Mr. Quisling accepted the bouquet of strips, extending one to look at the letters written on it. "Interesting, Mr. Lee." Mr. Quisling gave an approving nod and distributed James's cipher to the class. Emily looked hers over. It was unlike anything that had been turned in for the challenge so far, and unlike anything she and James had talked about cipher-wise. The strip read, and here it is. What is it? PIXLDFTCWLS. What? Where would you even begin to solve that? I don't understand. Emily wondered why the cipher was vertical instead of horizontal, and why were there 5 sets of 2 letters evenly spaced and then 1 letter at the bottom? Was the message 5 different 2-letter words and then a 1-letter word? Were there even 5 different 2-letter words that could be used to make up a message? She didn't know how to start decoding this. Neither do I. Not that she wanted to solve it or would turn in her solution if she figured it out. They might not be talking, but she still wanted James to win his bet with Maddie. After school, just to be on the safe side with those men, Emily left through a different door from the main one they had walked out of yesterday. She took a different route too, maybe to avoid running into James as much as to avoid those men if they were to come back. She didn't actually think they would come back because she'd done something brilliant she was rather proud of. On Book Scavenger, she listed the gold bug as hidden in the outer sunset. She'd picked that neighborhood off a map because it looked about as far from their school as you could get without leaving the city. For the clue, she looked up that old language Maddie had used for her cipher challenge, Ogum, and used it to write out directions to an imaginary bench in the park. If the men were looking for the gold bug as James suspected they were, and they were paying attention to what she did on Book Scavenger, then this would lead them to a bit of a wild goose chase. She just wished James would talk to her so she could tell him they didn't have anything to worry about now. When Emily walked in front of the room of their apartment, she was kind of surprised to see Matthew sprawled on the couch waiting for her. Even though he'd said he'd go book hunting with her after school, she'd half expected he would bail on her. Matthew jumped up. "All right, let's go. I mapped out the address. 1155 Leavenworth, right?" He held up his phone for Emily to confirm. You remembered, Emily said. Matthew tugged her ponytail as he passed by and headed down the stairs. Of course, Flemily, he said. Lead the way, barf you, she replied, but was smiling as she followed her brother out of their front door. On the bus ride to Leavenworth Street, Emily wondered what James was doing. Probably studying in his room or hunched over his cipher books or logic puzzles with Steve, defying gravity, like a diving board of hair sticking off his head. As if he'd been reading her mind, Matthew pulled out his earbuds and asked, So what happened with James? Why didn't he do this with you? Emily shrugged. They passed a lady unloading grocery bags from the trunk of a car parked on the sidewalk. Matthew was silent a moment longer, then said, He'll get over it, whatever it is. Don't worry. Easy for you to say, Emily said, still looking out the window. You make a zillion friends every time we move. It's why you love moving so much. Matthew snorted. I don't love moving. If you asked me a few years ago, I would have rather bleached my hair and burned off my eyebrows again. Giggles bubbled up at the memory, and Emily pressed her fingers to her lips to stifle them. She remembered her brother tearing out of the bathroom with a towel over his face, shrieking, It burns! It burns! It wasn't funny at the time, but it was a little funny now that everything had worked out okay. Emily couldn't imagine there'd be a time he'd rather go through that again than move. Go ahead, laugh at my expense, Matthew said, but he was smirking too. This is how our life is. It can be cool in a lot of ways, you have to admit. Matthew waved as if their bus, with the lone man gripping an oxygen tank and the Sharpie-scribbled seats, was what constituted his cool. But I used to hate moving. You really hated it? Before we moved from Connecticut, remember? Emily remembered Connecticut, but she didn't remember Matthew being upset about moving. I had just started a band with Ollie and his brother. I didn't want to leave and start over somewhere new again. I even ran away, I was so mad. You ran away? Not the real kind, but I went to Ollie's house and told his mom I had permission to sleep over when I didn't. Mom and Dad figured it out. Were they mad? No, but you were. Me? As hard as she tried, she had no memory of any of this. You loved moving back then. Remember you made us do the family map? Of course she remembered that. The family map had hung in every kitchen since they'd made it. The Cranes Conquer America was written at the top in Emily's 8-year-old scrawl back when she was putting smiley faces inside her E's and A's and O's. Metallic stars dotted the cities where they'd lived. You got it in your head that we could have an elk for a pet when we moved to Colorado. I was going to name him Monty, Emily said. She spent a lot of time drawing pictures of her and Monty and the adventures they'd have in Colorado. I think I'd gotten Mom and Dad seriously reconsidered moving, and you thought I was ruining the fun. That's when Mom and Dad let me get a phone to keep in touch with my friends. And it turned out Colorado was a cool place to live, although you never got your pet elk, so you might not agree. When I finally figured out with all our moving is that you miss out on stuff whether you stay or go. So I decided to just go with it, embrace how we live. There was a Jack Kerouac quote that their dad loved to repeat when the family deliberated weekend plans. Emily said it out loud. What's in store for me in the direction I don't take? Exactly, Matthew said and inserted his earbuds. If they'd stayed in New Mexico and Colorado or Connecticut or any of the other states, she never would have met James or ridden a cable car or found Mr. Griswold's book. Even though they'd only just moved to California and she and James weren't talking, she wouldn't trade these last few weeks away. Matthew was right. You missed out on stuff either way, or you gained stuff, depending on your perspective. And that is the end of chapter 29. What a great talk between Emily and Matthew. Matthew is so wise. I forget that about him. All right, I will see you guys next time for chapter 30. Bye.